In 2013, an African-American man named Albert Perry did something millions of people do every year. He mailed a swab of his own DNA to a genealogy company, hoping for nothing more than a clearer picture of his family tree. What came back should not have been possible. His Y-chromosome, the piece of DNA passed only from father to son, did not fit anywhere on the known human family tree. It branched off earlier than every other lineage ever recorded, earlier than science believed our species had even developed the diversity to produce. For a moment, geneticists Fernando Mendez and Michael Hammer thought they were looking at a data error. They were not. What Albert Perry was carrying inside his own blood was one of the oldest pieces of living human genetic history on Earth, and it had been sitting there, unnoticed, for generations. That single test cracked open a much bigger question, one that reaches directly into the blood of millions of black people alive today. If you are black and you carry type O blood, there is something inside your cells right now older than any kingdom, any language, any border ever drawn on a map. For most of the last 100 years, doctors treated blood type as nothing more than a label on a hospital wristband, useful only if you ever needed a transfusion. Nobody thought a blood type could hold a story. Then geneticists opened up the DNA behind that single letter, and what they found rewrote the timeline of human history itself. This is not simply the familiar textbook line that humanity began in Africa. This is about one mutation that may be older than our species itself, older than the moment the word human even meant what it means today, and it is still sitting quietly in your veins right now. So where does this blood actually come from? Why does the letter O on a medical chart reach back further than almost anything else a human being can carry? And why did science spend decades getting the headline of this story backwards before finally getting it right? Stay with this, because by the end, you will know something about your blood that most retellings of this exact story still get wrong. Start at the beginning, because even the mistakes here are worth knowing. In 1901, a young physician in Vienna named Karl Landsteiner noticed something strange happening in his laboratory. When he mixed blood samples taken from different people, some samples clumped together and others did not. That single observation cracked open an entire hidden biological system, and it allowed him to sort human blood into the four groups still used today: AB, AB, and O. Landsteiner later won a Nobel Prize for the discovery, and blood typing became one of the most useful tools in the history of medicine. For decades, that is all a blood type was permitted to be, a medical fact rather than a historical one. To be fair, that medical fact alone changed the world. Before Landsteiner's discovery, doctors had no real idea why some transfusions saved a patient and others killed them within minutes. They were essentially guessing with human lives. Once blood typing became standard, transfusion went from a dangerous gamble to one of the most routine life-saving procedures in modern medicine. For the first half of the 20th century, nobody was hunting for ancient history inside a blood sample. They were simply trying to keep people alive. The idea that this same letter, A or B or O, might also function as a time capsule from deep prehistory was not even on the table yet. Here's where a lot of retellings of this story go wrong, and clearing it up actually makes the real story better. You have probably heard that type O is the original blood type, the ancestral version everything else grew from. Genetically, the claim is backwards. The A version of the gene is the one shared most broadly across primates, including our closest living relatives. Type O came later, born from a mutation that broke the A gene. So, in a narrow technical sense, O really is the newer version. But newer does not mean recent, and when scientists went looking for exactly how old that mutation is, the answer was almost too strange to believe. Here's what is physically happening inside your cells. The gene that decides blood type sits on chromosome 9, and its only job is to build an enzyme that attaches a specific sugar molecule to the surface of red blood cells. Attach one sugar, you get antigen A. Attach a different one, and you get antigen B. But in the most common version of type O, a single letter of genetic code is missing entirely. That one missing letter shifts everything that follows out of order, the same way deleting a single letter from a sentence turns every word after it into gibberish. The resulting enzyme comes out broken. No sugar gets attached to the cell surface at all. A type O red blood cell is essentially a blank cell, flying no flag for any pathogen or immune system to read. So how do scientists figure out when a single missing letter first appeared, tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, with no written record to check? You cannot carbon date a mutation directly. What you can do is study the DNA sitting immediately next to it. Every time a mutation gets copied down through the generations, small additional changes accumulate around it, almost like growth rings inside a tree trunk. Count those rings across O-type carriers on every continent, and researchers can estimate roughly when, and sometimes even where, that mutation first appeared. This is where the story stops being a tidy Africa origin footnote and becomes something far bigger. Researchers did not just find that this deletion predates the human migration out of Africa, a migration that most genetic evidence places somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago. They found something that reaches back much further than that. When scientists sequenced ancient DNA pulled from Neanderthal skeletons recovered at the El Sidrón cave site in Asturias, Spain, they checked whether Neanderthals carried the same missing letter. They did. A separate analysis of Siberian Neanderthal and Denisovan remains later confirmed related O-type variants sitting in archaic hominin DNA as well. Think carefully about what that actually means. This mutation did not appear sometime in modern human history. It existed before our lineage even split apart from the Neanderthals, which places its minimum age at several 100,000 years. Researchers tracing the deeper evolutionary history of the entire ABO gene system across primates have pushed its roots back tens of millions of years into ancestry we share with other apes more broadly. The specific O-causing deletion itself is younger than that far deeper split, but it is still almost certainly older than our own species. This is not only an African story in the way a textbook footnote might frame it, it is a story that starts before Africa and humanity were even separate ideas, inside a population of ancient hominins that every human being alive today, and quite possibly our Neanderthal cousins too, inherited a fragment of code from. Wherever that ancestral population eventually settled and became fully human, it happened in Africa. The mutation was already there, waiting, long before anyone ever walked out of that continent. Sit with that for a second. This is not simply that your ancestors carried this gene before they left Africa. It is older than the line separating human from not quite human yet. It is baggage from deep in our evolutionary past, carried forward generation after generation by people who had absolutely no idea what they were carrying inside them. If a claim this large rested on just one gene, skepticism would be fair. Single genes can mislead, producing flukes from one small sample. What makes this story solid is that it does not rest on one gene at all. The same pattern shows up again and again, independently, across completely different pieces of the genome. The Y-chromosome, mitochondrial DNA, and blood group systems that have nothing structurally to do with the ABO gene. Different tools, different chapters of the genome, different research teams working decades apart, and they all keep pointing back to the exact same place. That kind of agreement from datasets that never spoke to each other is exactly what convinces scientists a pattern is real instead of coincidence. Some of the strongest evidence did not even originate inside a research lab. It started, as you already heard, with an ordinary DNA kit mailed in by a man who had no idea what he was about to uncover. But blood type is only the opening scene. To understand how deep this really goes, you have to zoom out from one gene to the entire human family tree and ask a question most of us were never taught to ask. Map blood types across the modern world and clear patterns jump out immediately. Type A runs unusually high through parts of Western Europe. Type B is especially common across northern India and Central Asia. Type O dominates much of West Africa, and it is also extremely common among indigenous peoples of the Americas, for reasons tied to a separate, much more recent migration event. But frequency only tells you which blood type is common where. It does not tell you which population represents the trunk of the human family tree, and which populations are later branches. For that, you need a different kind of evidence. Here is the part that consistently surprises people, no matter how many times it gets explained. Every population outside Africa, every European, every East Asian, every indigenous American, every Pacific Islander descends from a relatively small group of people who left the African continent sometime in the last 50 to 70,000 years. When a small group splits off from a larger population, they only carry a fraction of that original population's genetic diversity forward with them. Geneticists call this a founder effect, and it compounds every time it happens again. Every further migration into the Middle East, across Central Asia, over the Bering Land Bridge and into the Americas, carried forward a narrower slice of the diversity that came before it. That is the mechanism behind one of the most consistently repeated findings in human genetics. The farther a population's ancestors traveled from East Africa, the less genetic diversity they carry today. It is reliable enough that researchers can roughly estimate how far back a population's roots trace just by measuring how much diversity has been lost along the way. The numbers this produces are almost hard to believe. Two people sampled from different populations within Africa can differ from each other genetically more than a Norwegian differs from someone in Japan. Read that again if you need to. The genetic distance between a Scandinavian and an East Asian person can be smaller than the distance between two neighboring populations inside Africa. That is not a rounding error. It is the fingerprint of the fact that Africa has been home to modern humans far longer than anywhere else on Earth, long enough for far more genetic diversity to accumulate there before any of it ever left. The fossil record backs this up. For most of the 20th century, the oldest known Homo sapiens fossils were dated to roughly 195,000 years old, discovered in Ethiopia. Then came a twist almost nobody outside paleontology knew about for decades. Back in 1961, miners working at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco pulled a skull out of the ground and assumed it belonged to a fairly recent Neanderthal, perhaps 40,000 years old. It sat filed under that assumption for over 50 years. Then in 2017, a research team returned with modern dating techniques and got a result nobody expected. Those bones were roughly 300,000 years old, and the face, looking back at them, was unmistakably modern and flat, matching our own proportions, even though the brain case behind it was longer and more archaic than a skull today. It was not a transitional oddity. It was evidence that our species did not switch on in one location, in one moment, the way a light flips on. We took shape gradually, across multiple regions of Africa, over a much longer stretch of time than anyone had assumed. Either way, the math lands in the same place. Something like 80 to 85% of our species' entire existence happened inside Africa before a single group ever crossed into Asia or Europe. Everything after that migration is not the main story, it is the epilogue. There is one discovery that makes this timeline feel real instead of abstract, because it did not come from a dig site at all. It came from the same kind of routine DNA test available to anyone today. Every man alive carries a Y-chromosome, passed down almost unchanged from father to son across countless generations. That makes it a nearly perfect tool for tracing paternal ancestry back through time. Compare Y-chromosomes from men around the world, and researchers can build a family tree of humanity's entire paternal line, tracing it back to a shared convergence point, sometimes nicknamed Y-chromosomal Adam. This is not one literal first man. It is simply the point where every living man's paternal line meets. For years, that convergence point was estimated at around 140,000 years ago. Then in 2013, Albert Perry's ordinary DNA test blew that number apart. His Y chromosome branched off earlier than every other known lineage on record. Their initial calculation placed that branch point, which they named A00, at roughly 338,000 years ago, older than the fossil evidence available for modern humans at the time, and it triggered real scientific debate. Later researchers, applying different assumptions about mutation rates, argued for younger figures, and estimates have since been refined using updated methods, though even the more conservative calculations still place A00 among the oldest human paternal lineages ever documented. That kind of open disagreement is not a weakness in the science. It is simply what normal scientific debate looks like, while the field is actively refining its tools. Here's the part that turns this from a statistic into something closer to cinematic. Because Perry's genetic markers were so unusual, researchers went looking for anyone else on Earth who carried something similar. They found it in a small number of men from the Mbo and Bangwa peoples of western Cameroon. The single oldest documented paternal lineage in our species was not sitting inside a museum case. It was quietly living in the blood of men in Central Africa, and in the blood of a man in the United States who had no idea what he was carrying when he mailed in a routine DNA kit. This matters beyond one man's story. Companies like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and specialty services like African Ancestry are all built on the same underlying science, reading Y chromosome and mitochondrial markers against reference databases collected from populations around the world. So, if you or someone in your family has ever spit into a tube and mailed it off, you have already touched this body of research. Most results will not turn up something as extraordinary as A00, but the method is identical. The same tree ring logic applied quietly to your own DNA every time someone checks their ancestry results. There is a mirror story on the maternal side, landing in almost the same place. Mitochondrial DNA passes from mother to child with very little change, making it the maternal counterpart to the Y chromosome, a second independent way to trace the deepest roots of the human family tree. Build that tree, and the oldest branch is called haplogroup L0, concentrated today among southern African populations, particularly Khoisan-speaking communities whose ancestors split off earlier than any other group on the maternal side. Every mitochondrial lineage found anywhere else on Earth, in Europe, Asia, the Americas, or the Pacific, nests inside that African tree as a smaller, later branch. Then there is a genetic story that is not really about deep time at all, but about survival, and it might be the most direct evidence anywhere of what your ancestors actually lived through. It involves a lesser-known blood group system called Duffy. Most people of European and Asian descent carry a molecule on their red blood cells called the Duffy antigen. But among people of West and Central African descent, something like 90 to 95% carry no Duffy antigen at all, one of the sharpest genetic dividing lines found anywhere on the planet, nearly universal in African and African-descended populations, and rare almost everywhere else. That is not a coincidence. It is a lock with no keyhole. A malaria parasite called Plasmodium vivax needs to grab onto that Duffy antigen in order to invade a red blood cell, the same way a key needs a matching lock. No antigen, no way in. Across huge stretches of West and Central Africa, this particular strain of malaria has nearly vanished simply because the population there evolved to remove the exact door the parasite depends on. It is one of the cleanest, most well-documented examples of natural selection, responding to a single disease anywhere in the human genome, written directly into the blood of hundreds of millions of people alive right now. If you laid a map of Duffy negative frequency over a historical map of Plasmodium vivax malaria, the two maps would practically trace each other, dense across West and Central Africa, and thinning out fast the further you move from that zone. Type O might carry an echo of that same evolutionary pressure, though the science here is genuinely more mixed than the Duffy story. Several studies have found that people with type O blood tend to develop less severe cases of Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest form of malaria, compared to people with types A, B, or AB, likely because infected red blood cells clump together less easily when missing the A and B surface markers. But the effect size shifts from study to study and population to population. It remains an active area of research, not a settled fact the way Duffy has become, and any honest telling of this needs to say so plainly. Duffy and type O are not even the whole toolkit either. There is the sickle cell trait, which subtly reshapes red blood cells in a way that makes it harder for the malaria parasite to survive inside them. There is a G6PD deficiency variant with a broadly similar protective effect, and hemoglobin C found mostly in parts of West Africa. Geneticists call these balanced polymorphisms, because each one comes bundled with a trade-off. Carry one copy of the sickle cell variant, and you get real protection against severe malaria. Carry two copies, and you develop sickle cell disease. That trade-off is what keeps the genes circulating in the population instead of disappearing entirely or taking over completely. Stack all of these mechanisms together, and you are looking at an entire evolutionary arsenal, built over an enormous span of time against one of the deadliest threats our species has ever faced. Your blood does not just remember where your ancestors lived, it remembers what they had to survive to get you here. Getting that ancient African inheritance into the blood of black people living today across the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe runs directly through one of the most brutal chapters in human history, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than skimmed past. Historians estimate more than 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes during the transatlantic slave trade, and roughly 10.7 million survived the crossing. Thanks to decades of archival work, we now know these departures were not some vague blur of Africa treated as one undifferentiated place. Close to half of all captives, by some estimates, were taken from West Central Africa, the coastline running from present-day Gabon down through the Republic of the Congo and Angola. Large numbers also came from the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and Senegambia further north. For people transported specifically to what became the United States, Senegambia and West Central Africa were especially significant sources. The regions carrying some of humanity's oldest genetic lineages were, in a bitter historical irony, also among the regions most heavily targeted by that trade. The crossing itself, known as the Middle Passage, could take 1 to 3 months, packed under conditions deliberately designed to strip away every trace of individual identity before a ship ever reached land. Names were erased, languages were stripped away, families and communities were split apart, often deliberately as a means of control. The paper trail that should have preserved generations of family history was destroyed, falsified, or simply never written down. For countless descendants, there is no surviving document that leads back to a specific place, a specific people, or a specific person. For a long time, that felt like a door closed forever. That is exactly why it means something when a DNA test can now compare someone's mitochondrial or Y-chromosome markers against modern reference populations and say, with real confidence, that a lineage traces most closely to the Mende people of Sierra Leone or to communities in present-day Cameroon. That is not a small thing to hand someone whose family history was deliberately erased 200, 300, or 400 years ago. It is a name where there used to be only blank space. But something survived that no ledger, no bill of sale, no single act of violence could ever fully touch. The DNA itself, the type O mutation older than our species, the Duffy-null trait standing as a shield against a disease that still kills people today, the deepest paternal and maternal lineages ever documented, carried forward without interruption even while every written record of where they began was destroyed. That is exactly why genetic ancestry testing has become so emotionally significant for so many African-descended families, not as a replacement for the history taken from them, but as a partial, imperfect way of recovering a thread of it. A person may never learn their great-great-grandmother's actual name or her specific village, but the DNA she passed down is still speaking, still traceable, still hers, and still theirs. Now, put all of it together because it adds up to something that runs directly against a story a lot of people were quietly taught, even if nobody said it out loud. That story is the idea that Africa was humanity's humble starting point, a place other civilizations eventually outgrew and left behind. The genetics say close to the opposite. The mutation behind type O blood predates our species entirely. The Y-chromosome lineage with the deepest known roots traces to Cameroon. The maternal lineage with the deepest known roots traces to southern Africa. The single largest reservoir of human genetic diversity anywhere on the planet is still Africa, right now, today. None of this means any single bloodline is worth more than another. It is not, and any version of this story that suggests otherwise has missed the entire point. What the evidence actually supports is narrower than that, and honestly far more remarkable. It is a claim about time and about continuity. This lineage came first. Every other population on Earth is, genetically speaking, a branch that grew outward from it. If you grew up being told, directly or through the silence surrounding the subject, that your family's story was a blank page, that the record had simply failed to survive, here's the thing worth hearing clearly. The page was never actually blank. It was unread. Every cell in your body has been quietly holding on to that record the entire time, waiting for tools that could finally read it back. Those tools exist now, and what they keep finding, one gene at a time, is not an absence. It is some of the deepest, most continuous ancestry that human genetics has ever documented anywhere on Earth. So the next time you see a single letter O on a lab form, or think about your own ancestry or someone else's, know what is actually sitting behind it. A mutation older than our species, a paternal lineage still living in Cameroon that may be the oldest ever recorded, a maternal lineage rooted in southern Africa that every other lineage on Earth branches out from, and a genetic shield against malaria built over hundreds of thousands of years that is still protecting people right now, today. None of it was erased by history, even when the paperwork was. It was only ever waiting to be read again, and now, finally, it is.